Hello, everyone. This is Emily Brooks from SmartBrief. Along with Foundations in Learning, we are pleased to be hosting today's webinar, Reading Intervention, when the traditional mastery model doesn't work for middle school students. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Carolyn Brown from Foundations in Learning. Carolyn?
Thank you very much, Emily, and welcome to all of you who have joined us this afternoon, and thank you to our panelists who will be contributing today. As Emily said, I'm Carolyn Brown, and I'm very pleased to serve as your moderator of the webinar today. The webinar will focus on those middle students who still continue to struggle to read, and today we'll be introducing an alternative to the mastery model called the varied practice model. As the webinar proceeds, you can ask questions at any time on the chat side, the right-hand side of the screen in the question window. And at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A period, and we will attempt to get all of your questions answered. If we don't have time, or if some of them are not exactly in the same category, we will respond by email. And as you exit, you will be asked to fill out a questionnaire, which is actually a way that we get feedback on how we can improve the webinar. So for those things that were effective, we'd like to hear, but we'd also be very interested in knowing how we could make it more effective for future webinars and future panelists and participants. The panel today, in addition to myself moderating, will be with Dr. Bob McMurray. He's at the University of Iowa, and with Twila Baedke, and she is a former special education literacy teacher. And our case study today that we'll be presenting actually comes from Sioux Falls, and this is where Twila Baedke was a teacher and continues to consult with this district. Before we get started, I would like to just introduce you to Jessica, and it was through Jessica that this project first started as a research project and has evolved into a wonderful collaboration with the University of Iowa and an application of the varied practice model called Access Code. Jessica, when we first met her, was a third grader. She was a highly motivated little girl. She already in the third grade had a history of many interventions, and she struggled with fluency and comprehension because she lacked automaticity. And even though the youngsters that we'll be talking today are in middle school, many of them will have the same characteristics that Jessica struggled with. She was not able to distinguish vowel ambiguities and struggled with the lack of one-to-one correspondence in the sound symbol system. She wasn't able to use the structure of the syllable, and I'm sure that as many of you are sitting here looking at these three areas, you're probably thinking of middle school students right now who may have difficulty with decoding, with word attack, chunking multisyllabic words, and many of your youngsters, because they don't have automaticity at the first two levels, also don't understand the mapping of phrases to the underlying syntax of oral language. And as we began working with Jessica, it was clear to us that we had to have a different approach, that the mastery model, which had been used in many of the interventions to which she'd been exposed, simply wasn't working. She wasn't able to retain or generalize the information, and she simply lacked the ability to quickly recognize words or to move any of her word-based work into connected text. So we actually learned about the varied practice model, and it's a model that is robust in many other disciplines, and we couldn't find that it ever had been applied to the area of reading. We began working with Jessica, and she, in a year, moved from the 14th percentile to the 75th percentile on the Iowa Basic Skills Test. And then we moved that to other small group, school-based studies, and then we teamed up with the University of Iowa with Dr. Bob McMurray and his colleague, Dr. Elliot Hazeltine, and we performed some randomized school-based studies, and we'll talk about one of those today because it is dealing with older students in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And then Dr. McMurray and Dr. Elliott and their colleague, Keith Applebaum, actually were awarded a National Science Foundation grant to test the underlying premise of the varied practice model in word recognition. And we are extremely lucky today to actually have Dr. McMurray serving as one of our panelists. And he is a colleague and a collaborator with us. He is an associate professor at the University of Iowa. He serves in two departments, Department of Psychology and the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. And this year, Professor McMurray earned the very prestigious Young Scientist Award from the American Psychological Association. We're extremely lucky to have his contributions today, as he's one of the world's experts in learning theory with particular expertise in the varied practice model. With that introduction, Professor McMurray, I'm going to hand it over to you. And today, as we actually think and talk about middle school students, I would like to just pose a question to you. What do you think it is about middle schoolers struggling to read? What do you think is most unique about that population of students?
Well, I think in some ways they might know a little too much.
Yeah, the middle school students who struggle might know too much?
Well, it's not that they know too much. They need to know a lot more about reading, obviously, but they know a little too much in the sense that we've taught them lots of strategies for dealing with text. We've taught them all the phonics rules. Many of them can even verbalize particular rules of phonics. They know they're supposed to be able to read, and yet they really can't do it all that well. And all of this knowledge is in some ways a burden.
So why I mean, this is counterintuitive to what I would have thought we might have begun with, that these students know too much. Why when they come in, I mean, they obviously haven't had the practice of the fundamental skills and reading. They lack information, and we talk about knowledge, and you just described the knowledge that we've been trying to impart to them. Why is this knowledge getting in their way?
Well, what we know about reading in the cognitive sciences now is that it's only in part an issue of knowledge. If you think about the rules of phonics, for example, there's about 1,200 different rules that describe how letters map onto the sounds of the English language. There's no way to master that as a set of knowledge. You can't sort them out fast enough. When kids are confronted with a single word, they just can't do it. What they need to do is get a feel for it, right? They need to stop thinking and do it in a more intuitive, more automatic sense. And when these kids are coming to the classroom embarrassed, when they're facing anxiety because they know they don't do as well, when they're fed up with all the testing, they can't actually do it. So it's more of a Nike approach. They need to be able to just do it. And we need to develop their skills in a way that enables that kind of automaticity.
Okay, well, I think automaticity is really I think the key about what we're talking about today. And these kids certainly come into middle school lacking it. Can you just talk a moment about how students who have it get it, or how they should get it?
Sure. So in many ways, learning to read is like many other skills, like, for example, shooting a basketball or sailing a boat or playing chess. You know, people who are good at those things don't think about what to do. They work at a very intuitive level. It's very fast and it's very flexible, but they don't have to stop and reason out what the right way to set their sails are, right, the right place to put their elbow is to make that basketball shot. So this has to be fast and it has to be unconscious. Now, the key from the perspective of teaching, of course, is how to make things fast and unconscious, but also generalize and also be flexible, right? You don't want them just to recognize the 20 words you've taught them, but to be able to apply those skills to everything. So, for an example, from driving, when we're driving a car, we don't have to remember that we push the brakes to stop or reason that if a car ahead of us is stopping, we should stop. We just do it automatically. Now, think about how we all learn to drive a car. We didn't learn to drive a car on your own cul-de-sac with no traffic, right? We learned to drive a car by driving on the interstate, by driving in the city, by driving in reverse, by driving forward, by driving with passengers, by driving without passengers. And only in those very varied contexts can you learn to drive in a very intuitive and flexible way. If we only learned in one context, if we only learned highway driving, it'd be really easy to derail the learning. And to focus on something very specific, like how to get on an exit ramp, as opposed to how to smoothly merge into traffic. And so what we need to do is sort of stop assuming that knowledge is the whole part of the story, and that kids need this kind of practice and this kind of skill to get them to read in a way that really promotes generalization.
Okay, so you gave us some great examples, actually, about automaticity, and I think it's easy to connect to each one of those because many of us have been drivers or we've been trying to learn a new skill and get automatic. I don't think it's quite as easy to get there with reading. And if you could just explain this slide and tell us what the difference between reading knowledge and reading skills is. If you could just give us a little more detail there.
Sure. You know, like I said, reading is a skill, and it's really a lot of different skills that kids have to deploy all at once. But when we talk about reading to kids and to each other, when we plan our curriculum, we often use the language of knowledge. For example, we talk about whether kids get the concept of a syllable, whether they understand how syllables work, whether they know the rules. Those are really about knowledge. Those are really about, does the kid have an explicit understanding of some principle, not really about whether they can use that principle to decode text in the moment. The real contrast here is between knowledge and performance, and they're both important, and it's very difficult to disentangle those things. But as teachers, we should be focusing on performance. You know, there's probably many children out there who actually can't verbalize all the rules. I'm not sure I can, and yet I can read very quickly, and that's really what we should be focusing on. The rules of phonics are a great example, right? We teach them as explicit rules. When you have a silent E, you use the long form of a vowel. When you don't have a silent E, you use the short vowel. And we get kids to think about this and to learn to apply it in various situations. And actually, a lot of kids are able to go from that pretty quickly to skilled reading, into flexible abilities, into automatic decoding. But for the kids that fail, I think it's actually probably a good idea to think about teaching it more as a skill and to try a different approach based on the principles of skill learning. And again, if you think about the vast number of rules there are, children who are struggling may have a real hard time puzzling it out, and maybe by getting that explicit sort of conscious thinking out of the way, we might do better.
Okay, well, this kind of flies in the face of what we know and what we've thought about and we do and as teachers, I think. Can you sort of take that position for a moment and tell us how this applies to teaching?
Well, I think it takes the emphasis a little bit off of what and how we teach and changes it just slightly to put the emphasis on how kids learn. And in a sense, what we're trying to determine here is how kids learn and the conditions under which kids learn. That's what's really critical to success. And then we can, once we understand that, we can incorporate those principles into just about any curriculum. And so the idea is to focus on learning for a little bit and then return to teaching when we understand learning. And there's a huge body of research in the cognitive sciences about how people learn skills, about how they learn to shoot basketballs or fly planes or whatever. And we can use that to tune how we teach and to tune the environment that we construct for kids to learn in.
Okay, so you just talked a little bit about reading really is a complex skill. It is not just one part. It's many things that have to be understood and integrated. Maybe if you could break it up for us and talk about other complex skill learning and what's important there, and then we could bring it back to reading.
Sure. One of the principles that we've learned in decades of work on complex skills is the importance of variability. Just to go back to the example of driving for a second, you wouldn't learn to drive in the same car on the same roads at the same time of day with the same other cars and the same other drivers on the road. The only way to really learn to drive is to learn in lots of conditions, lots of different types of weather, lots of different types of traffic patterns. Because driving isn't just knowing that you push the accelerator to go fast and you turn the wheel to go left. It's about the relationship between what's happening on the road and what you're supposed to do in the car. And we know that people need this kind of variability to learn flexible skills. So for example, people who study basketball shooting, very surprisingly we find that even if you're just trying to improve players' performance from shooting at the foul line, they learn better if you have them take a couple steps forward and a couple steps back and shoot from a variety of distances. Another great example, worked on pilots learning to land planes, luckily in a flight simulator, so nobody was harmed in this study. They found that the pilots got the approach angle right more often if they varied even things like the color of the ground and the width of the runway. It was seeing all the different circumstances under which they might have to land a plane that really gave them those flexible skills. Work in my own lab has looked at very young infants, at 14-month-olds, who have a really hard time learning words that sound the same. So if I tried to teach them the words ball and doll, for example, or I could teach them novel words like book and pook. And we find that when we add multiple talkers, so different numbers of people saying the words as opposed to the same talker saying them over and over again, that the children actually learn surprisingly quite a bit better. And the explanation is that children don't know that the voice of the talker isn't relevant. They go ahead and encode that anyways. And it's only by having it vary that they realize, oh, this really isn't relevant for distinguishing the words. Just like pilots, when they're beginning their training, don't know that the color of the ground isn't relevant for the approach angle. And that has to be learned. What variability does is it puts the learner's attention on the things that are really important and pulls it off of the things that aren't. And I think the critical issue that's raised by all of these studies is we can't assume that kids know in advance what the important parts of a problem are. They tend to lock in on whatever you show them, or whatever examples you give them. And variability, if it's done right, can help the right aspects of the problem to pop out.
Well, that's very interesting because typically as a teacher and someone who knows how to read, I think we tend to act from that expert point of view, and we try to set it up so it's easier for the students, and we point out what we think they're not getting or what they have to get. But could you explain how maybe that is not the best approach?
Sure. Let's take, for example, the rules for pronouncing vowels. These are really difficult. The number one thing that struggling readers who struggle with decoding struggle with are vowels. Consonants are relatively straightforward. And the reason these are so difficult are that the phonics rules are ambiguous. When you get, for example, an E followed by an A, that could be pronounced as E, as in bead, but it can also show up like in head and threat. And kids have to figure this out. They have to figure out these very ambiguous rules. Now, the problem that kids face when they first learn to read is that they don't know the difference, really, at an implicit level between consonants and vowels. And they don't understand the important role of vowels in organizing the syllable. Now, from a knowledge-based perspective, we would think that kids need the concept of a syllable, right? They need to understand this. And in fact, I just used that term. You can see how easy it is to slip into it. But what does this really mean from a skill-based perspective, right? Well, what it really means is that the vowels are in the middle, the consonants go on the outside, and they play different roles in predicting how to pronounce that word. So how would we teach them this? Well, in the old way, what we would do is something like the mastery approach. We would use pairs of words or word families like mat and mate, rat and rate, fat and fate, which really kind of isolate the critical rule and help them kind of pop out in a way. At least that's the understanding. And you can see quite clearly here how the as, the A's by themselves, and the A's with the silent E's pop out. But the problem with this is if you don't understand that the vowels are what's important here, so do the T's. All these words have T's. And in fact, many of the words share the same first consonants, the M's, the R's, and the F's. And as a result, kids are going to get confused. Well, is it the T that's important? But the T predicts both sounds. Is it the M that's important? Same thing. And we're giving them lots of conflicting information. Now, the contrast would be a variable approach. So here we're illustrating the exact same rules, an, A, but we're giving them variable consonants. Now, if you look here, the only thing that's going to pop out is the relevant vowels. There's nothing else that could possibly be regular. And as a result, the kids are going to be forced to find these as the most relevant dimensions. So in a way, it seems like it makes the problem harder, but it actually makes the problem easier, right? The only thing available for the kids to work on are the vowels, even though there's a lot of different things going on at the same time.
And so what does the science of learning, you've just given this example, but you've actually tested that example in the National Science Foundation study, is that correct?
That's right. So Elliot Hazeltine and Elliot actually studies motor skill learning, and our graduate student Keith Applebaum recently conducted a study in which we taught kids 6 different phonics rules. And the only thing we varied between the 2 groups of kids was whether the consonants were highly variable or highly similar. And we're showing you the results here. The green bars are the pre-test performance on a variety of different decoding tasks. The post-tests, of course, are the purple bars. And you can see that the group that had variable training had almost twice as much improvement. Now, we also looked at individual differences in the study, and we found that if we look at the high performers, so the kids who are performing best at pre-test, we see the exact same changes here. We can see that both groups did some learning, but the group getting variable training did a lot more learning. But now the most important thing, I think, for today's discussion are the low performers. And here we see that the group that got similar experiences didn't learn at all. There was a significant difference between them, and the variability group had quite a large change. And so it may be that for the kids that are performing the worst, we need the most variability to kind of get them out of their old ways.
Wow, and what's really interesting, just looking at this, is that instead of doing that, we do the opposite. We try to make it simpler, and by making it simpler, we reduce the variability. But it appears to me, Dr. McMurray, that the variable for both the high performers and the low performers looks about similar in terms of gain, and that is exactly the opposite of what we might predict.
Right. I mean, my own intuition as an educator to do exactly that. When a student doesn't understand, you simplify, you simplify. And for the level of understanding, that makes sense. But reading is a skill. And by using just the right kind of variability, we can go a lot further with these low-performing readers. The other thing we looked at was generalization. And here we saw a really startling pattern. The group trained on similar sounds or similar consonants showed literally no generalization to a novel task, where the groups showed going variability, showed quite a bit of generalization. So these gains that we see extend to new tasks. They also extend even to new words. And so the variability really seems to create a robust amount of learning that can really generalize to new things.
And that is precisely what we need to get these students who are struggling at the word level. They have to be able to generalize it to new words and also to connected text. And I think this is a very serious piece of basic science that actually just was reported this past month in the Journal of Developmental Psychology.
That's right.
And congratulations on that.
Thanks.
So as we think about what you've just said, you gave us some examples. We talked about complex learning. We talked about how it applies to reading, and then you took us through some recent research. How do we make this work more broadly?
Well, I think there's a lot of principles that we can take away from this, and these are principles which can apply to just about any curricular approach. The first thing is that kids need lots of different tasks. They need to see the same information, the same mappings in lots of different ways, and to do lots of different things with them. But they also need a lot of data. If you think about a kid learning the mapping between letters and sounds, every time they see a word and hear it, that's data, right? And what they need is lots of different words in rapid succession, right? They need a lot of practice all bunched up together. And they need a lot of variety in that practice. They need words with lots of consonants. Now, it's really important, though, that we don't just vary everything. We can't just go around saying, well, I'm just going to make everything in the classroom as variable as can be, because I think you're going to lose a lot of kids that way. The critical thing is that you have to vary the stuff that's not relevant to what you're trying to teach, and keep the stuff that is relevant constant. So anything, if you're trying to teach a vowel rule, you vary the consonants. If you're trying to teach how syllables work, you use lots of different numbers of syllables and lots of different forms of the syllables, but have to have the constancy about the types of syllables you're using, for example. The key is to figure out what's relevant and what's not relevant, and vary the irrelevant. And the struggle as a teacher is we don't always know what seems to be relevant or irrelevant from a child's perspective. We need to kind of get into their heads a little bit and figure out all the things that they might be paying attention to that we don't expect them to attend to.
So once again, you're taking it back to the learner and what the learner needs as opposed to the teacher.
That's right. And I think there's a real bonus for this approach, right? When you're using lots of different tasks and lots of different words, when you're giving kids real-time feedback, that's the exact circumstance in which kids are most interested and most engaged, and so they're most willing to do this work themselves.
So it takes some of the repetition out because there is a certain element of them having to think, and maybe it is that the more difficult you make it, in some ways, the more interesting it is and the more engaged the kids are.
I mean, in our experiment, the kids loved the experiment. They come in every day excited to do it. And it wasn't really all that exciting, but it was just enough variability to keep them motivated. It didn't feel repetitious to them, even though what we were really doing was giving them over 200 trials over the course of just a couple of days.
Could you also talk just briefly about the feedback and real-time feedback about errors? One
of the things we know from skill learning is that kids need feedback immediately. They need to know if they got the answer right or wrong as quickly as they can. The brain simply tracks feedback and ties it to the input much better under those circumstances. That can be really difficult to obtain in a reading group, in a class setting. And I think that's where some alternative approaches come into play.
So perhaps you can talk about how we do get so much variability into the classroom, how the data can be used. I mean, you talked about needing data. They need to extract what's important. They've got to derive these rules. How do we do that in our very complicated classrooms today with kids who have so many needs?
Well, one thing that can help, although it's certainly not a panacea, is computers. By using computer-based tools, we can have very precise control over which words are used. We can give kids feedback as to whether they're right or wrong, and we can deliver a lot of words more quickly. This isn't the only way to do it, and this isn't necessarily something you want to do on its own, but computers can give us some of these aspects of skill learning that are very hard to deliver short of one-on-one attention with each student. And this, I think, has really big ancillary benefits for middle schoolers. We talked at the beginning how middle schoolers often feel embarrassed about their lack of an ability. And this really allows them a little privacy to develop these skills in a way that's intimately tied to how the brain learns things. Middle schoolers also want a lot more control over their activities than, for example, a first grader might like. And a good computer-based intervention can give them that. Middle schoolers often feel burned out. They've done the traditional classroom route for years. This is something different and something new. Now, it's again critical not to just throw a computer at a kid and say they're going to learn to read. It's using technology in a way that's sensitive to the principles of learning that's going to give us the most bang for our buck.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. We have had a lot of questions that have come in during your session. To keep on time, we are not going to stop and answer those now. We are going to proceed, and we'll hear from Twila Baedke in just a moment, and then at the end of that, I just want all the listeners who have been participating, I would like to thank you for your questions, and then we'll make sure that we get to those questions with meaningful answers. Before I introduce Twila, I would just like to sort of tie up what you've said and how access code, which is the application of the very practice model, how it was developed just as a little bit of an intro so that as we're talking to Ms. Baedke, the audience has a sense of what the students actually did. So the issue that access code is working to solve is that students who continue to struggle with fluency and comprehension because they have deficits in automatic word recognition skills need a different model in which they can learn this information. And the approach that we took was to actually make it web delivered, so all the advantages of computer technology with students who need another approach was available. And then the innovation actually was that the curriculum that we designed, which you made several comments about, that it's not just, you can't just vary anything. It has to be varied in a way that what is important pops out. And that's what we attempted to do, and that's what we've been working with your lab to actually see if we have been effective in creating the curriculum in such a way. And then the model itself, this is sort of a schematic. We took the curriculum, and there are 24 units that actually focus on key decoding areas, and then that gets poured one unit at a time into the varied practice learning model. So the varied practice model that we employ here is about 20 tasks that the students see for each unit. The words get pushed through those 20 tasks, so they see them, just as you mentioned, Bob, they see them in many contexts, and what their job is really is to figure it out themselves. And because we do use technology, the opportunity, the personalization, we can optimize what they need in order to support generalization of this automatic word recognition into more complex tasks, such as reading phrases, learning multisyllabic words, and actually getting to connected text with fluency. And before we shift to talk about the Sioux Falls study, could we talk just a moment about Bridgeport? It was a randomized study that you were involved with a group of ninth graders there. And if you could just briefly talk about what happened. It was in about 11 and a half weeks of access code there.
Yeah, so these were a group of ninth graders that were falling behind, like many of your own students. We used the Ames Web comprehension measures to kind of assess in a sort of quick way their reading level, and then they got between 11 and about 16 or 17 weeks of access code. So this is quite a bit more than we, for example, used in the small study I told you about. This is virtually the entire intervention, so it covers most of the different phonics rules, lots of different decoding skills. At the end of the intervention, we did an immediate test, and we found on the exact same measure that the kids had jumped up significantly by over a grade level. The kids who received access code, the control group, were about where they were. And so this is a small sample. It was, I think, about 50 or 60 students total, but we got pretty robust results in a pretty short amount of time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we may have further questions on that, and we can link it also to some individual data that Twila collected in her classroom. And now I would like to introduce to the participants, Twila Baedke, and we are extremely pleased to have Twila join us today. She is a retired teacher. She retired last spring after giving 34 years of her professional life to being a special education and literacy teacher. And she currently is called a teacher on special assignment. So even though she has retired, she remains with the Sioux Falls District and is working every week to help create conditions for children to actually acquire these very important skills. And Twila, if I could just hand it over to you now, and you could talk maybe for just a moment about your district in Sioux Falls.
Thanks. I'd love to. Coming from southeast South Dakota, Sioux Falls School District, where Carolyn said I have taught the last, actually 33 out of 34 years here. We have about 24,460 students. Minorities, we have 29.5%. And our special education population is about 13%. We also have about 33.7, I see, on free and reduced lunch. So within our district, and we are the largest city in South Dakota, we have 24 elementary schools, and I believe there are more going up. We have 5 middle schools and 3 traditional high schools with 2 alternative high schools. And I worked at one of those 5 middle schools.
And Twila, can you tell us pretty briefly, the role that you played over the years within special ed, is that right?
Right. I spent all 34 of my years have been in contact with special education. I taught at the elementary school for a year. I taught at the high school a couple years, but the majority of my time has been spent and I age myself here, with junior high and with middle school students working in special education, and I was more in what we call in South Dakota the resource program, where we spend time with students that are learning disabled, attention deficit, behavior, and emotional.
Okay, and Twila, we're getting some feedback that your audio is not coming in really well. Could you perhaps maybe just get a little closer to the mic?
All right. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay.
So you were one semester from retiring last year, and we're just wondering what could possibly have been going through your mind that made you initiate a new intervention at that point in your career.
Well, I will tell you, it was a cold February day, and I had just come in from bus duty. So honestly, at that point in time, I was thinking about retirement in May, because it sounded much better. But I went to a Job Alike meeting, and my colleagues told me that they had this program that they were going to be piloting, and I really wanted to know more about it. Because every year, it seems like I have 2 to 3 students that would move on to the high school, since we had 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, that really didn't have the skills and really didn't make the progress we needed them to make to be successful at the high school. And it really came down to what flashed in my mind was a student called Dylan. Dylan came to me as a 6th grader. He was this bespectacled young man who was just excited about learning, but he struggled to read. I mean, he really struggled to sound out words. He'd get the initial sounds, the consonants, but then he'd guess at the next words. And he worked. He really did work. And after 3 years, you know, despite our best efforts and despite his working at it, he really became discouraged. And we really hadn't made the gains that would, you know, lead him on to be successful at high school. And I guess the day that came to my mind that really just sticks with me was watching him take our standardized tests, which are called the Dakota Step Test. And we had a reading text, and here he's confronted with these 2 pages of an article he was supposed to read and answer questions on. So I read the directions to him. He looks at me and pays attention. He proceeds to bubble in all of the answers, not having read anything, lays his head down, and just tunes out for the next 40 minutes, whatever the test was supposed to take. He proceeded and did that again and again. It just broke my heart, literally, to watch him struggle through that. That just wasn't right. And I really felt, how could I not try this? I mean, this looked like a program that might meet kids' needs that I hadn't been able to do before that.
So perhaps, thank you very much, actually, for that story. I think that resonates probably with many of the people who are listening today about these students who have great capacity and for some reason just cannot break through that reading barrier. Could you perhaps tell us what you had tried in the past and why you think it might not have worked?
Well, you know, you can see on the screen that we had some great comprehension strategies and materials to work on that. We worked on some fluency, and that worked for, you know, many of our kids. We tried to look at affixes, their meaning, their identification, and as they get to middle school, you know, you don't do so much of the word recognition as much or word attack. And we really lacked a systematic program to really work on those skills. And we moved on trying to do other things with the students. So the things we had looked at oftentimes weren't very age appropriate. We had looked at some other computer programs, we looked at some web-based things, but they just weren't as systematic, I guess, and not as intensive as students like Dylan needed to make progress in his reading.
And I think what we're seeing around the country as we're talking to teachers and administrators is that often they are not really sure if their students have automatic word recognition, if those skills are in place, and if that is what's causing problems with their fluency and comprehension. And I was wondering if you might just generally describe your students in your 6th and 7th grade that you had it as your last year, and whether or not it was primarily a reading problem, or if you knew if it was an automatic word recognition issue.
That's a good question. Probably not. I mean, in special education, we identify our students, and the majority of the students I've worked with were learning disabled, and were identified as that because they showed a discrepancy in their ability, their cognitive ability, and their performance. So they were placed in my classroom for reading instruction. Most of them had identified on the Woodcock-Johnson that they were weak in word identification and or word attack. So those were the students that I had in my classroom and worked in the access code.
And can you talk just maybe quickly about what attracted you to access code that was different, that you hadn't been integrating perhaps in the instruction for these youngsters?
I have to say, when I got a chance to look at this program, I thought, I think this is what I've been looking for. I mean, I was really excited because it gave them practice time, and it was different. And I don't even know, I'd been trained in the mastery model, so there was something different about it. It just gave them so many opportunities in a variety of activities, and that was exciting. I think the fact it was web-based, if there was a computer for my kids, they loved it. They loved the fact that they could work on their own, be independent. Like I said, they had a lot of activities, a lot of repetition. It broke those words into word parts and syllables, and that's what I've been trying to do, but I really didn't know how to do it well, I don't think. And again, as I said, it was really paced for their needs. They needed the practice. And the fact that they could hear those sounds and see them, it just seemed to pull it all together of what I've been looking for.
And so, as Dr. McMurray was speaking earlier, and he was talking about the varied activities, how did you see your students respond to the many different ways? Did you wonder if that was a good idea or if it would work? What were your students saying about seeing words presented in so many contexts?
Well, I think I liked that they were short activities. I think they were quick, and there was a reward quickly for them. They thought, well, this isn't bad. I can do this. At first, they were like, I don't know. Is this just one more program that you're going to put me into, and we'll see what happens. But they really seemed to click in eventually. I had to sell them on it, but I think they gave them a variety of things to work with. I mean, there's a lot of activities within that, each lesson that they do, each unit.
And could you talk for just a moment about how teaching struggling middle school students might be different from younger struggling readers? Because they're at a sort of special stage before going on to high school here.
Boy, it's a tough one. Middle school is a tough time in so many ways, but if you have a student that comes in that's struggling to read, you just add on top of everything else that they're trying to deal with. What I noticed was that my students came in, a lot of times they'd tell me right up front, I don't like reading. And more times than not, they just lacked real confidence in it. They'd look at words, they'd look at the beginning of the word, and they'd kind of guess at the rest of the word, or, just read through it either quickly or just jump over it because it didn't make any sense to them. And what I really see is as we're going into more and more pressure for students to perform at a higher level, those expectations of what they're supposed to do academically increases. And the difficulty.
Twila, could you speak up just a little bit? I think several of the participants are still struggling to hear you.
I'm sorry.
If you could just speak up a little.
Okay. I think as kids move into that middle school, those academics getting harder and harder for them. The reading material is more difficult, and the amount of reading they have to do increases as they go from 6th to 7th to 8th grade. And when they lack, you know, that automaticity, it's the time that they have to spend to do an assignment increases significantly from what maybe an average learner would do. So they get very discouraged. They struggle. Some of them spend most of the day struggling to hide that they don't read well, but that it takes them so much time. So I think by the end of the day, they're very fatigued and exhausted, and then I'm going to work on reading with them on top of that. So I think that a middle school student just is dealing with so much that it's easy for them to get very discouraged and want to give up.
So how do you motivate them, or what recommendations do you make today in terms of these struggling students?
Well, I can speak about how I motivate them probably a bit to do this, to begin at least, to try the program. But I think as a whole, if I'm going to start a new program with them, I need to talk with them and explain why it is that we're going to do this program, what is it going to work on. They've heard it all before. How many programs have some of these students been through by the time they get to middle school? You know, how is this going to meet their needs? And then walk them through it and show them what they need to do. The other piece I found, I was very fortunate because we started this about the time we had parent-teacher conferences. So I could sit down with both the parents and the student and just talk about the program and say, you know, this is new. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to work on. And as a parent, I asked that they would be supportive, ask their student about what they're doing with it. It really became a partnership between us. And I think the thing that I feel is so important for these kids to motivate them, they need honest feedback. They need to know, they need to have evidence that they're improving those skills. And they need it frequently, and they need it very specifically, I would say. And I found that in the program because I couldn't always get around there, but they could see they were making progress.
And so in terms of the evidence of improvement for them, for middle school youngsters, perhaps you could just talk about some of your observations with them as they started to realize that they could, in fact, make these skills automatic.
What was really fun for me was we would read these passages together as they finished their units. And at first I thought, well, you know, it seems like they're gaining some confidence, and they're at least attempting to sound out words that weren't familiar to them. Wait a minute, you know, they'd say, just let me try. And they started to make connections with other word parts they had seen, sounds. They went, oh, that's like. And the part that really, you know, what really tickled me was when they got to one of the units with the R-controlled vowels, I believe it is, and they were just complaining, these 7th graders. They're like, now, that speaker, they're just not doing well. I can't tell the difference between an AR, an ER, or an IR. And I thought, oh my goodness, they can actually hear those sounds. I'd never heard that from them before. So I knew something was happening with them. And it was fun to see them start to gain more independence. They wanted to, we would do a choice reading, and they would use the support of audio books if they wanted to, and many of them used that. But they began to try more books and request books that didn't have audio support. I thought that was really a key. They wanted to try it on their own more. So that, to me, was the evidence I saw from just observing the students.
That is great. I think those are the observations that probably coming from a teacher of 34 years, seeing those changes must have made you feel like you were doing your job at the end of last year, or your last year of teaching. You also did do some individual assessment before the school year and at the end of the school year. And the San Diego Quick Assessment is actually words that they read, 10 words for each grade level, and then when they miss 2 or more, then you stop the test. So you can see very quickly where they are in terms of their grade level with word recognition. And typically, what would you expect to see with these struggling middle school students on the San Diego?
Well, optimistically, we always looked at a 1-year gain would be what we'd love to see, but, you know, oftentimes that didn't always happen. So, you know, we were absolutely thrilled, and the kids were thrilled to see that they had made gains when we did our exit testing at the end of the school year. So that was very exciting.
That is, it's clear here that some of the youngsters made a year, but some made as many as 2 and 3 years of gain on this. They're really multisyllabic words on the San Diego Quick Assessment.
Right.
And could you just sum up? I know that you had a student named Amy who is very expressive, and perhaps you could just give us a summary statement about Amy. And I know there are many stories like Amy, but you certainly touched us with this one.
Well, Amy was just this delightful young lady who struggled to read maybe a 1st or 2nd grade level of word recognition. And Amy, I interviewed Amy after school was out just to talk about how did this impact her in her reading. And she talked about, one of the things she said was, my parents were thrilled because they didn't have to, they were less frustrated with me when I was at home reading and homework. I could do more of it independently. I thought, wow, so that was exciting. Daily work, she said, you know, I can go in a restaurant and I can actually begin to read words on the menu. I don't have to ask my mom. And for a 7th grader, that's huge. So I asked her at the end, and I said, Amy, if you had 60 seconds to tell administrators or other teachers, what would you tell them? And I thought, this just hit me. She said, don't write me off. Don't give up on me. Just give me a little bit of help, and I can do it. It just struck me that we just can't give up on them. We can't give up searching for the tools that will help our kids, you know, really open that door to literacy. So Amy sticks in my mind. We can't give up on her.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for actually taking on a new initiative in your final semester before you retired, and thank you for sharing the stories, especially Dylan and Amy this afternoon. And we have a lot of questions that have come in, and we have about 7 or 8 minutes, and so we're not probably going to get through each of them, but as I said, we will get these out in email form. But I think that we'll start with one that is directed to Dr. McMurray, asking if he could go back to the example of varied words and explain what the teacher might be doing with those words.
Sure, and you know, there was a number of questions that came through about different strategies for using variability in different levels. I think the point is, with the variability, is that this is something you could tailor to whatever you're trying to teach. So the varied words that we used were really designed to teach phonics rules. And if you know, for example, you're going to be working on vowel phonics rules, you vary the consonants. But there's lots of other sources of variation that can be relevant here. For example, you could put the words at different positions in the sentences. A lot of the sentences that we give to children end with the target word, or they start with the target word. If you know there's a particular class of words you're interested in, make sure they show up in multiple places. That might be more appropriate for older readers. Make sure you have words with different kinds of morphology, EDs and final S's and prefixes and suffixes. You also should be thinking about using both words and nonsense words, and about lots of different tasks. We've come up with dozens of different things you can do with the exact same words. You can ask kids to spell a spoken word. You can ask them to select which of a number of spelled words match what they hear. You can ask them to pronounce, fill in missing letters, verify that the sound and the spelling match. If you're creative, you can think of lots of different ways to do this. And you put all these variations together around a core construct like a vowel phonics rule, and you can do quite well. The same can be said if you're trying to teach comprehension, right? If you want to teach, for example, something like what a metaphor is, using metaphors from different domains, using them in different parts of the sentence or different parts of the paragraph. The key thing is to figure out what's important, hold that constant to the best of your ability, and to vary it otherwise. And many of these strategies can simply be incorporated into existing lesson plans. If you have spelling lists you're using and you're working on vowels, make sure the spelling lists vary on consonants. If you're working on consonant clusters, make sure the spelling lists have lots of different vowels in them. The point is that these are principles of learning that are not necessarily a curriculum. They're a way of adapting your curriculum to the way that children actually learn.
And I think also whenever you were talking about the different ways in which you could embed words, to make sure that you give them, you know, short tasks that they can complete and maintain interest, and then you actually switch the task so then they see how that can be applied to another kind of activity, so you don't have to burden them with being bored or having it repeat. Make them short, focused tasks.
I think that's right. And the principle is that if you give kids enough different tasks and enough different words, they can't memorize the words, and they can't memorize how to do a particular task. All they can hope to do is learn the regularities of the system, and that's exactly what we're striving for here.
So I think another question that's come in is how this applies to English language learners. So students who come in and English is not their primary language are not as facile with oral language, and so it is difficult for them to see those contrasts pop. If you could talk about not just with learning how to use different activities to help develop their oral language, but then how they might in fact engage in print activities that would be appropriate for them.
Well, I'm going to have to speculate a little bit here because we haven't looked too closely at ESL students yet. But it seems to me that they are faced with a number of problems when learning to read. They might already have some knowledge of the letters from their former language, if the letters match, and they probably have a different set of speech categories or phonemes they're already working with. So they have to sort of relearn the letters, relearn the sounds, and then learn the highly complex mappings between sounds and letters that English faces. And so this might be a situation where you want to structure things a little bit differently. For example, Twila was talking about students, obviously first language students, but who had never heard the difference between air and R. Well, those are children who might need a little bit extra development on the sound side of things. So maybe then you want to use variable words that all instantiate that, but you might also want to introduce multiple talkers or multiple ways of saying the same word to help encourage the development of their perceptual skills. I think similar principles can be applied to ESL students.
And so basically what you said about the other students, give them short, focused tasks that give them a variety of ways to see something. You may introduce more oral tasks instead of going right to the print. It's really important for them to hear the auditory and to start making those connections. But basically, the learning principles apply to those students equally as well and could be very, very important because they don't have the broad base of oral knowledge. So it would be important for them to have multiple tasks to make it make sense.
Yeah, I think, again, the point is the variability helps them get something at a sort of fundamental level that they're just not going to get from repeating the same thing over and over again. And I think that applies just as well to ESL students as to middle schoolers, as to first graders.
Okay, and we're just looking here. So I think you've already sort of generally hit on the teaching comprehension. And this is one, based on what is presented, could a teacher introduce variability by providing more mathematical information?
Poetic passage.
Yes, or passages related to different cultures.
So I think this is a really interesting idea, especially if you're teaching things like reading comprehension or you're teaching words that may play different roles. Here the idea is that by introducing variability in the content of the passages, would that help? And I think that's almost certainly the case. If children always read about cats, for example, in the context of paragraphs about text, they may not be able to recover that as well. And so this is an example of tailoring the variability to what you want to teach. And I think thinking about content variables is a really good idea, particularly for those kids who are past the early decoding and word recognition stages.
Okay. We have just 1 minute left, and I think just so we can end on time, I would like to thank all of you who have sent in questions, and there are many that we didn't get to, and we will be responding and answering those and getting back to you. We would thank you very much for staying through the webinar, and for those, as you exit, we would ask again to please complete the questionnaire so we will know what was effective for you and what we could do better. And then there is also the possibility, we do have some pilot opportunities that are still available for access code, and we would just like to make that known that if you are interested in the questionnaire as you leave, you can indicate such. And that our next webinar will focus on reading intervention for English language learners, and it will be on January 15th, 2 o'clock Eastern Time. So we thank you very much, and thank you, Bob, and thank you, Twila, and hope you have a great afternoon.